Well, let's open up to Genesis 39. And for those of you guys who are not too deep into Genesis yet or haven't got through it, which no shame in that, is just how it happens. It's a long book. Genesis 39 is talking about a guy named Joseph. Any of you guys heard about the story of Joseph? Maybe the coat of many colors? A guy gets sold by his brothers into slavery. Yeah, it's an interesting story. But we find ourselves in the point in the story where he gets favored by his father. He has this nice coat that his father gives him. His brothers get jealous. They beat him up. They rip his coat. They kill a goat, rub goat blood all over this coat and show his father and say he's dead. And they throw him in a hole. And they wait for their cousins, the Ishmaelites, to come by, and then they sell him to them. And they find him, and they take him to Egypt. And that's where we find ourselves in verse 39. And it says this, or chapter 39 of Genesis, verse 1 through 12. It says, "Now Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian official of Pharaoh, Potiphar, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites." Remember, Ishmaelites are the cousins to the Israelites. And so the Ishmaelites who brought him down there. And Yahweh was with Joseph, and so he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all that he did to succeed in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended on him, and he appointed him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he gave in his hand. And now it happened, awesome, it is back there. And now it happened, from the time he appointed him overseer in his house, and over all that he owned, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. And thus the blessing of Yahweh was upon all that he owned, in the house and in the field. And so he left everything that he owned in Joseph's hand, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now Joseph was beautiful in form and beautiful in appearance. And it happened after these events that his master's wife set her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. And he said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. And he has given all that he owns into my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I. And he has withheld nothing from me except for you, because you are his wife. And how could I do this great evil and sin against God?" So it happened that after she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her to be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household were inside. Then she seized him by his garment, and saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. And so we're going to end there, but the rest is essentially she frames him, and he gets arrested and put into jail. And he spends a long time in jail until he's freed by bringing an interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. Really interesting stuff. Read it later if you have some time. But the big question that I want us to dig through today is, how do we live out God's presence in the workplace? And that's a really big one, is how do I be a Christian in my workplace? For many of us, sometimes we work in places where there's not a lot of Christians. The language is not what Christians usually use. The behaviors aren't usually what Christians use. For those of you guys that are in the trucking world or drive trucks, you guys might know what I'm talking about. And, when we're going out to barns, a lot of jokes, a lot of interesting stuff that gets said, especially with certain barns. And so the way that we present ourselves can bring God's presence into that workplace, or it can keep God's presence out, like normal. And so when we're beginning to think of that, our workplaces can be some of the most challenging places in our lives to integrate faith into, to talk about Jesus, to live out a life for Jesus. There's pressures, there's expectations, there's different temptations. All of these invite us to kind of make two different lives. Our spiritual life on Sunday, maybe in a Bible study, maybe when we get together with our Christian friends, and then our work life or our normal life when we get together with the people who don't get together with Jesus, right? So we begin to separate our behaviors, our lifestyle, the way we think. But Genesis 39 shows us the life of a man named Joseph who didn't separate his life, his work, what he was forced to do, because he is a slave at this point in time. He didn't separate that from his faith in Yahweh. And for those of us who understand, we serve the same God as the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? It's the Trinity, the idea that there is the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit. And so Yahweh is the God that we serve, and so did Joseph. So we looked at essentially this story with his, where we looked at what the example of a successful worker under a foreign household, or we could say a successful employee under a pagan workplace. Potiphar worships the Egyptian gods. Potiphar is Egyptian. Joseph is a follower of Yahweh. And so there are two different gods that are represented in this household. And very much like you guys in your workplaces and some of my workplaces, there's two gods represented. There's the God that we worship. There's Christ. There's Yahweh. There's the Trinity, God the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And then there's the God of this world. The God of this world who wants to draw us away from faith, who wants to dive us into temptations, into different things that pressure us to live a certain way, act a certain way, talk a certain way. And so when we look at Joseph, we see that he doesn't separate this. He's an example of how his faith shaped his work, his integrity in work, and really how he changes the environment that he's in. And that's a really big thing about how we bring faith into our workplaces. It's about bringing God's presence with us. The first point that I want us to really dig into is faithful work reveals God's presence. When we are faithful in the things that we do, when we're diligent in the things that we do at work, God's presence is shown there through us. There's this idea in Genesis, I've talked about it a little bit in the past, called the Imago Dei, where we are representatives of God's presence here on earth. We're made in a certain way. If you guys remember last week, we talked about being created in the image of God. God said, "Let us make man in our image." And so we are image bearers of God. We represent God. We reflect Him. And so when we're in our workplaces, we have the opportunity to reflect God in those places. Genesis 39:2-4 says this, "And Yahweh was with Joseph, and so he became a successful man." You guys want to know how to be successful at work? What's the key phrase that it says right there? Yahweh was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. It doesn't say that he served a Christian. It doesn't say he worked for a follower of Yahweh. He served, he was a slave to a master who was Egyptian, who was someone who served foreign gods. But despite that, verse 3 says, "Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all things he did to succeed in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended on him, and he appointed him overseer over his house, and over all that he owned he gave in his hand." There's a key phrase that's repeated twice here. Yahweh was with Joseph. And that's the big thing that I want us to point out. When we're beginning to identify, how do we bring faith into my workplace? How do I bring faith into, my driving job? Or how do I bring faith into, a workplace where it's rough people, or maybe to Costco where I work, or, maybe to whatever it is that we do? How do I bring my faith into there? Well, the first one is that Yahweh was with him. We have to be in a relationship with God that is identifiable, that people can see. It says that Potiphar saw that Yahweh was with him. So if we want to know how to bring faith into our workplace, we have to start by people seeing that we have a faith to begin with. We have to let people know that there is faith there. It's not just we go with the crowd, we act the way they do. So the key phrase repeated twice, Yahweh was with Joseph. And the author emphasizes the divine presence as his source of success. It doesn't say Joseph was naturally gifted, or that Joseph had certain talents that the other ones did, or that Joseph was smarter than someone else, or Joseph was better than someone else. It says that success was given by Yahweh himself. The Hebrew word salak, something like that, you don't quote me, I'm really bad at Hebrew, that's not my strong source. It means to flourish. That word, it says, and he became a successful man. That word is salak, something like that. but it can be interpreted as prosperous. If you guys remember a while ago, I taught on prosperity. The idea that to be prosperous doesn't necessarily mean to be rich. Well, here, how is Joseph a slave but prosperous? Because a slave doesn't own anything. A slave's not rich. A slave doesn't have many possessions. His prospering was alluding to this, the idea that he was flourishing, that he was advancing, that he was prospering under divine favor is what that word represents. So Joseph's success was spiritual, not necessarily circumstantial in terms of material wealth, finances. But he prospered in terms of favor with his master. And that's a big thing. When we want to be successful in work, it doesn't necessarily mean we make more money or we're richer at work, but success could look as more favor with your managers, more favor with those bosses who are over you, more favor with those who have influence over you. So when you bring Christ into your workplace, oftentimes Christians are the most liked employees. Why? Because they serve the best, they work the hardest, they treat people the best, they try not to cause drama, they try their best to respect the rules of the workplace. Oftentimes Christians are liked most if you're truly bringing faith into your workplace. If you're a Christian but you're not bringing your faith into your workplace, then you're looked at as everybody else, right? Drama, complaining, not working hard, showing up to work late, not clocking in on time, running your hours. All these things are things that can be deemed as not worthy of working the way that Joseph worked. One of the interesting things here with Joseph is that even a pagan master can identify that Joseph had faith, that Joseph's God was real because of how he worked. And that's a really big thing for us when we're beginning to identify how do we incorporate our faith into our workplaces is, can my boss see that Christ is real by my actions? Can my boss see that Jesus is true by the things that I do, my behaviors, my work practices, my work ethic, my integrity at work? Joseph's pagan master could see real results through the way that he acted and he behaved. So, continuing, your work can be a visible expression of your faith. Remember how I've talked about worship not just being singing songs? I say it somewhat often, not too much, but worship is not just singing songs. Work is a part of worship. And when we work as a form of worship, it becomes the visible expression of our faith, the way that people see Christ through the way that we behave. When we work with integrity, when we work hard, when we treat others well, people can see Christ through us. So what does that mean? Practically, we show up on time. That's a big one. My father instilled that within us growing up, where he would have all the clocks set back 10 minutes, or set ahead 10 minutes. So we always felt like we were 10 minutes late, and then we'd get there and we were super early. And it was him trying to instill this idea that we show up on time, and on time doesn't mean on the dot, it means 10 minutes early. Oftentimes I was a young adult pastor in Everett, and Sunday mornings, I would show up early, and I'd be the one opening the church because the pastor would run in 10 minutes after service started. So it was really interesting to see the difference in work ethic that was instilled within me versus other people. Not to say it's bad, but to say, maybe show up on time. But showing up on time, completing your work with excellence, being trustworthy. If your boss can trust you, it helps your boss see the Christ in you, right? She sees Jesus within you because God is with you in that space. You don't have to be a preacher at work to bring faith into your workplace, right? I don't need you guys standing up on a soapbox at work preaching to someone and trying to convince them something. In order for them to know that Jesus is real, you could do that. Hey, why not? Try it. But the best way to show people your work or your Christ, your God, is to show people your diligent work, your work ethic, the way that you're trustworthy, the way that you show up on time, the way that you treat people, the way that you treat customers. Customers can see Christ through you when you work in a certain way. So your diligence and integrity reveal who's inside of you. They reveal who your God is. Second is that faithful presence brings blessing to others. One of the super cool things that we see here is that God blesses a pagan household, which is the craziest thing because we often don't think, well, God's blessing those who don't believe in Him. If you guys remember when I talked about blessing and prosperity, I said oftentimes the wicked look like they're blessed more often than those who are righteous. Well, here it says in verse 5, "Now it happened that from the time He appointed him overseer in his house, and over all that he owned, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's household on what? On account of Joseph. Thus the blessing of Yahweh was upon all that he owned, and in the house and in the field, so that he left everything he owned in Joseph's hand. So much so that he did not concern himself," this is the master, "didn't concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Everything else he left into Joseph's hands." Now Joseph was beautiful in form and beautiful in appearance, and then it ends there for that section. But your faith, when it's integrated into your workplace, can be a blessing to your workplace. Something weird to think about. When you bring your faith into your workplace can be blessed. That means when you integrate your faith, say for storage units, because I know Jen manages a bunch. If you bring your faith into your workplace, God will bless that business. Why? Because you're bringing faith into something. You're bringing God's presence into something. You're managing it well. You're taking care of your customers. People are talking to other people about how Jen treats people well. She takes care of people. She looks out for people. And then God's blessing begins to come through form of you expressing God's hands and feet here on earth. The same with Jordan. If you treat your customers well when they come into the dump station, and you talk to your coworkers well on the radio, and you tell them, you're doing a good job. I know you stress me out, but you're doing a good job. Then God's blessing will begin to pour out in that place. So your faith can have a real impact on the places that you work. The blessing of Yahweh overflowed from Joseph into his employer's household. That's a big thing, because I can be a blessing to the place that I work. And it changes the way that we think about work. We think about work as necessary, grueling, I have to do it to make money. But when you shift the way that you think about work into, like we talked about last time, this is a calling. I'm called to be here. I'm called to serve here. I'm called to work here. And then you see it as I can bless this place. My actions, my ethic, my faith into this place can grow the business. It can help increase the finances of the business. I can bless those who work with me and the boss that oversees me. This anticipates the Abrahamic promise. Earlier in the chapter of Genesis, Abraham, the father of the Israelites, Joseph's grandpa, he gets a blessing from God or a promise from God, and God ends the promise by saying, "In you, all families of the earth will be blessed." And so through him, through his descendants, through those who follow Christ, all families of the earth are blessed or can be blessed. And Joseph's vocation becomes missional. His work becomes a mission. The way that he serves becomes a mission. He becomes the channel of divine blessing, divine grace, divine favor to his master's house through his administration of all things, through his taking care of things, through his managing of things, through his protecting of the master's interests. It all becomes a mission for him. It doesn't necessarily have to be preaching for you to be a blessing and to show Christ to your workplace. Work faithfully, work hard, use integrity, be a peacemaker, care for those around you. All these things will change the atmosphere of your workplace. For those of you guys who are stressed out about your work being toxic, which a lot of workplaces are, how do you change that atmosphere? You bring faith into the atmosphere. You begin to change it by your behavior, your responses, your actions. You change your thinking about it. You change the way you look at things. And that begins to let you see, it's not just toxic, but it's something that can be influenced. It's something I can bring the blessing of God into. The presence of a faithful believer often brings stability. This is why I say so many people like having Christian employees. Why is Chick-fil-A one of the best places to work for? Because it's Christian employees. Because they hire Christians. They hire people who will say, my pleasure. Do you need something else? Can I serve you? What can I do for you? When I worked at Chick-fil-A in Iowa, I was bivocational. I was working as an associate pastor and then as Chick-fil-A as the personal assistant to the owner. And every time I got put to work, I had a bunch of high school students that worked with me. And all of them would be like, this customer was so bad and blah, blah, blah. And I'd be like, it's okay, relax. And I would help bring calm and different things to them because I was able to bring a stable attitude to things. So when you work with high-stress individuals, your calm brings peace to them, theoretically. Some of them get annoyed that you're peaceful, and they're not. But that's just the reality of life. But we can bring stability, we can bring trust and faithfulness from us to our bosses by reflecting Christ in our workplaces. Just like Joseph brought stability to Potiphar's household. Joseph brought a faithfulness and an integrity into his workplace. 3 is the faithfulness at work requires integrity in the face of temptation. How many of us have the opportunity to sin at work? Yeah, a lot of us do. Because it's work, it's the world, it's everything. We have the opportunity to sin, whether it's to, swipe a few dollars of cash, or it's to, go to certain places, or to do certain things, or whatever it is. We all have opportunities, and we're tempted, and we have the opportunity to sin. Well, Joseph, in his workplace, he's a slave, remember, he lives in the household, is presented an opportunity to sin. Says, and it happened after these events, he's good looking, master's wife likes him, all right? He's good looking, he's a slave. Sometimes when you're a slave and master says you got to do something, you got to do something. You don't get a choice. Joseph doesn't fall into that trap. So we see it here, it says, and it happened after these events, his master's wife set her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. She had no hidden motive, she knew what she wanted him. But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. And that's the first key in our workplace when we're working with integrity. When I'm working here, I'm working at the pleasure of my boss. I'm working because I was hired and they trust me to do my job. And it says, with me here, they don't concern themselves with my work because they know that I'm doing the thing I should be doing. They know that I'm trustworthy, that I'm doing what I'm doing. He says, my master doesn't concern himself. He doesn't worry if our whatever is doing enough, or our lands are paying enough taxes, or the other servants are doing their jobs. He knows with me here, it's getting done. And he has given all that he owns into my hand. Everything that the master had access to, Joseph could manage and had access to. There's no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except for you. And that's saying, in our workplaces, if we're showing it to be in modern terms, there's things at work that we shouldn't do. Things that would be crossing into temptation, into sin, right? Whether it's you work at like Safeway and you can swipe a few dollars out of the cash register and say, we just were at a loss for some reason. There's different opportunities that we can sin, and our bosses usually don't withhold stuff from me without a good reason. They say, don't take money out of the cash register, it's going to be short and we're going to know someone took it. Why do they say that? There's a reason. They say, don't leave the back door open at night. Why? Because people will come in and steal stuff. There's rules there for a reason. There's things that are withheld from us, and we are given responsibility and we're told not to do certain things. And Joseph says, I have been given everything except you. That's a no-go zone. I can't touch the cash register. I can't take, the work truck out for a cruise on Sunday night because I don't want to spend my own gas. There's things that I'm given that I'm required not to do. And Joseph says, because you are his wife, how could I do this great evil and sin against God? He says that to sin against my master is to sin against God. To sin against my workplace, to sin against my boss, to sin against anything else is a sin against God. Why? Because sin hurts me and my relationship with God. And so if my integrity wavers, I'm not just hurting my workplace or damaging my workplace, I'm hurting my integrity with God, my relationship with God. And so, kind of continuing, it says this, "And so it happened that she spoke to Joseph day after day, and he did not listen to her to lie beside her or to be with her." She was constantly harassing him. And sometimes it can be that nagging feeling in the back of my head of, oh man, I know where the cameras aren't. I've seen the security room. I've seen where these cameras point and where they don't. And it's that nagging feeling constantly, I could get away with this. I could do this. Maybe just this. Maybe just that. But Joseph said no day after day after day after day. He constantly said no. And for us in our workplaces, when we're tempted with a consistent temptation or we're offered something that would cause us to sin, we have to continue to say no. So much more that it says this, that when she seized him by his garment, that is, she grabbed him by his cloak, says that he left his garment in her hand and fled. That means that he ripped it off of him and ran out. And she used that as evidence to, say that he did try to sleep with her and to flip it on him. But in our workplaces, it's important that we keep our integrity. And that's what Joseph does, is he keeps his integrity. They may not have believed that he kept his integrity. They may believe that he sinned, that he wronged his master. But what matters is that he knew that he didn't. And that's the big thing, is in our workplaces, if we don't do something wrong, we keep our integrity. And we know that we didn't do it wrong, even if everyone else thinks that we do. We don't have to worry about it. Why? Because God is the one who avenges. We see that later in Joseph's story, that God redeems him and essentially avenges him. He now becomes over all of Egypt. He's now no longer a slave, but the master of everyone. That's Potiphar's master. To the point where he is avenged by God. He's restored tenfold because he keeps his integrity. Now, that probably wouldn't have happened if he said yes, and he fell into the temptation, he fell into sin. Joseph's faith was not just a visible success, but a test in secrecy. It wasn't a visible test, it was a test in secrecy. And that's a big thing with integrity, is oftentimes our sin is something that happens when no one else is watching. Or it's presented to us when there's not many people around, and so we think about it. But when we can avoid sin in private, it's so much better when we know. No one else has to know that we are keeping our integrity. No one else has to know that we're avoiding sin in private. We just have to know, because that helps us keep what is integrity. Integrity is what's done and not done in private. Integrity is not a public thing. That's reputation. That's different. Integrity is what's done in private. When no one else knows, do I pray? When no one else knows, do I read my Bible? When no one else knows, do I talk to God? Do I trust God? Do I follow Him? Do I allow Him to influence me, to change me? All those things are what's done in private. His refusal to compromise shows that he feared God, shows that he had a relationship with God, showed that he cared about God. He says, why am I going to sin against God? Why am I going to choose to reject my God in order to please someone else? And so he doesn't care about losing his position. He doesn't care about losing favor in his master's eyes. He cares more about losing his God, losing relationship with God. That's the most important thing. When we look at Pharaoh's wife and we try to understand it in a modern context, it oftentimes looks like a moral or an ethical test of our integrity. Very likely you're not dealing with someone who's explicitly making advances on you at the workplace. I mean, it's not as often, not like this, obviously. But what we do see is moral and ethical choices that pass us by every day. Do I charge this person more because I don't like them? Do I charge them less because I do like them? Do I try to skim my workplace in order to benefit my friend or to benefit me? Right? There's different ethical things that we have the opportunity to do, and we choose not to do them based on our integrity. So Joseph's reasoning is this: how can I sin against God? And that's a really big thing. Every ethical decision that we make is aligned ultimately with God. Am I sinning against God or am I not? Every ethical choice that we make falls back into that category. Am I making a decision that honors God or a decision that dishonors God? Sometimes there's non-ethical or moral decisions, right? Should I have Pizza Hut or Little Caesars? what's better? It's not an ethical decision. That God probably doesn't care if you eat Little Caesars or Domino's, for the most part. Depends on who they're funding. But even when faithfulness costs us, as it did for Joseph, God's presence remains. And that's the big thing. We keep our relationship with God when we choose to have integrity in our workplace. So these are the things that we bring into our workplaces. The first one is that our faithful work reveals God's presence. That our faithful presence, that means us being there, being on time, taking care of our business, treating others well, brings blessings to others, to our boss, to our job, to that company, to the customers. And our faithfulness at work, it requires integrity in temptation. So this is our application. The first one is our faith at work reveals God's presence to others. That's a big thing. When we bring our faith into work, people can see God. People can see Christ through you. I think I mentioned this last week, but there's this beautiful song. It's by the Porter's Gate. And it's there's a line in the song that says, Christ has no body now but yours, no feet, no hands but yours. Because we are now his hands and feet here on earth. The way that we work, the way we treat people, the way we care for people, show people that Christ is real. The second is that we're called to be a blessing at work. We're not called to be a curse. That means I'm not called to whine and mope and complain and backtalk and, gossip with my coworkers about my boss, or gossip with my coworkers about my coworkers, or with my boss about my coworkers. We're called to be a blessing. All of you guys can think about someone who would be a curse at work. Someone who you can think is a curse because you deal with them every day. Maybe you're the person. But we're called to be a blessing at work. That's me when I work with Hannah. I'm like, I'm so hungry. Feed me. I need food. We're called to be a blessing at work. And 3 is, when we know God is with us, integrity becomes habitual. That's the thing. When I know God is with me, when I know he's watching with me, when I pray at work under my breath, when I think about Scripture, when I'm talking to God, integrity becomes habitual. It becomes second nature. It becomes the thing that I choose to do without thinking about it because I know Christ is there with me. I walk with him. So, those 3 things. Our faith at work reveals God's presence to others. We're called to be a blessing at work, and we know God is with us. When we know God is with us, integrity becomes habitual.